911, what's your emergency? I need to report someone who's illegally blocked a public road. People can't get in or out of our neighborhood. This is a serious safety hazard. That's what the entitled HOA board member, let's call her Karen, was screaming into her phone as she stood in front of my house, pointing frantically at the gate I'd installed on my property. This was land I legally owned, that I'd been paying taxes on, and that she thought she had the right to drive through whenever she wanted. I watched in disbelief as the police cruiser pulled into my driveway, lights flashing. All because I had the audacity to put up a fence on my own land that stopped this HOA Karen from using it as her personal shortcut. Can you believe it? She actually called 911 because she couldn't trespass on my property anymore. You're probably wondering how things escalated to this point. Well, it all started about a year ago when I moved into my dream home. A beautiful property with plenty of space, privacy, and a serene environment away from the bustle of city life. The house sits on a generous plot of land that borders a fancy neighborhood with an active HOA. When I bought the place, I was thrilled about the location. It was close enough to amenities, but still felt secluded and peaceful. What I didn't realize was that my peaceful slice of heaven came with an unexpected issue. A narrow strip of my land that connected to one of the streets in the HOA community had somehow become an unofficial shortcut for residents. It wasn't paved, just a worn dirt path, but it was clear enough to look like some kind of access road. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was something the previous owner had used, or maybe just an old trail. But that assumption was about to lead me into one of the most frustrating battles of my life against entitled neighbors who thought they owned my land simply because they'd been trespassing on it for years. Little did they know, I wasn't about to roll over and let them continue their entitled behavior. And that's how I found myself face to face with the most unreasonable HOA board member you could imagine. The first sign that something was off came about 2 weeks after moving in. I was having my morning coffee on the back porch when I noticed a sedan cutting across that strip of land. The driver didn't even slow down, just barreled through, like they owned the place. I remember thinking it was strange, but I brushed it off as someone who took a wrong turn. But then it happened again the next day, and the day after that. Soon, I was seeing multiple cars every day using my property as their personal thoroughfare. It wasn't just 1 or 2 neighbors either. It seemed like half the HOA community was in on it. I'd see everything from luxury, SUVs to delivery vans cutting through, shaving maybe 2 minutes off their drive by using my land instead of the main road. This can't be normal, I thought to myself as I watched a minivan zoom through one morning, the driver casually sipping coffee like they were on a public street. I decided to do what any reasonable person would do. I walked outside and waved at the next driver who came through, trying to politely let them know this wasn't a public road. The woman driving barely glanced at me, rolled her window down, just a crack, and said, "What's the problem?" with this look of utter confusion, like I was the one being unreasonable. "This is private property," I explained, trying to keep my tone friendly. "This isn't a public road or access point." She rolled her eyes and replied, "We've been using this road for years. It's the shortcut to Pine Street," before rolling up her window and driving off without another word. That interaction left me stunned. The sheer entitlement was incredible. I started researching HOA disputes online and found countless stories of homeowners dealing with similar issues. Neighbors assuming rights to private property, HOAs overstepping their boundaries, and the headaches that came with trying to resolve these situations. As the days turned into weeks, the traffic through my property didn't slow down. In fact, it seemed to increase. I'd see 5 or 6 cars pass through on weekday mornings, clearly part of people's commute routines. On weekends, it would be a steady stream of vehicles, residents heading to the community pool, visitors coming to the neighborhood, delivery, drivers taking shortcuts. I tried standing outside more often, making my presence known, but most drivers just ignored me or gave me annoyed looks. A few slowed down slightly, but no one stopped using the shortcut. It was like they had mentally designated my land as community property. Maybe I should talk to the HOA directly, I thought. Surely they can send out a notice to residents about respecting private property. How naive I was. I found the HOA's contact information online and sent a polite email explaining the situation. A few days later, I received a curt response. The area in question is outside of HOA jurisdiction and not our responsibility. We suggest you handle this matter privately with any individuals you believe are trespassing. Just great. The HOA was washing their hands of the whole thing, even though it was their residents causing the problem. I tried putting up small, private property signs along the strip, but they either disappeared overnight or were completely ignored. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday morning. I was working in my home office when I heard the distinct sound of tires spinning in mud. I looked out to see a large SUV had veered off the makeshift path and was now stuck, creating deep ruts in my lawn as the driver gunned the engine, mud flying everywhere. By the time I got outside, the driver had managed to free the vehicle, but had torn up a significant section of my yard in the process. The grass was shredded. There were foot-deep tire tracks filled with muddy water, and the driver was already speeding away without so much as an apologetic wave. That was it. I'd had enough. This wasn't just an annoyance anymore. They were damaging my property. That afternoon, I called several fencing companies for quotes. If the HOA wouldn't help, I'd take matters into my own hands. Over the next week, I finalized plans with a contractor to install a sturdy gate across the makeshift path with connecting fencing to prevent people from simply driving around it. I also ordered several large, impossible-to-miss no trespassing signs. The contractor assured me everything would be completed within 2 weeks. During this time, I dove deeper into researching property rights and HOA limitations. I discovered that in my state, if someone uses your land without permission for a certain number of years, they could potentially claim an easement by prescription, essentially a legal right to continue using your property. This alarmed me and reinforced that I was doing the right thing by acting quickly to assert my property rights. I also learned that HOAs have zero authority over land outside their boundaries, something I already suspected, but was glad to have confirmed. I printed out maps from the county assessor's office, clearly showing my property lines, made copies of my deed, and kept everything in a folder just in case. The day the contractor started installing the fence, I got my first taste of the resistance to come. A middle-aged man in khaki stopped his car at the edge of my property and marched over, demanding to know what was happening. "I'm putting up a fence on my property," I explained. "You can't block this road," he said, his face reddening. "People need to get through here." "It's not a road, it's my private property," I countered, holding my ground. "And I have every right to fence it." He muttered something about checking with the board and drove off. Over the next few days, as the fence took shape, I noticed more cars slowing down to observe the construction. Some drivers looked annoyed, others confused, but no one else confronted me directly. The fence was completed on a Friday, a solid 6-foot wooden fence with a heavy-duty gate secured with a padlock. The no trespassing signs were posted every 20 feet along the property line. The contractor had done an excellent job, and for the first time since moving in, I felt like my property was truly mine again. That Saturday morning, I woke up feeling relieved. The problem was solved. No more uninvited cars cutting through my land, no more entitled neighbors acting like they owned my property. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard it. A car horn blaring repeatedly, the sound getting more insistent with each honk. I looked out my front window to see a white luxury SUV parked in front of my new gate and a woman standing beside it, hand pressed firmly on the horn. Even from a distance, I could see the anger in her posture, her free hand gesticulating wildly as she looked toward my house. Little did I know, this wasn't just any angry neighbor. This was Karen, HOA board member and self-appointed neighborhood authority. And she was about to take this dispute to a whole new level. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and walked outside to face the commotion. As I approached, Karen stopped honking and marched toward me, designer sunglasses perched on her highlighted hair, wearing workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Are you the one responsible for this?" she demanded, pointing at the gate with perfectly manicured nails. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Yes, that's my fence on my property," I replied calmly, determined not to match her aggressive tone. "You need to open this gate right now. I'm already late for my Pilates class," she said, as if her schedule was somehow my problem. "I've been using this road for 5 years, and I've never had an issue before." I could feel my blood pressure rising, but fought to keep my composure. "I'm sorry, but this isn't a public road. It's my private property, and I've put up this fence to prevent trespassing." Karen's face contorted with disbelief. "Trespassing? This is a neighborhood access road. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I'm on the HOA board." She proclaimed this last part as if announcing she was royalty. In her mind, being on the HOA board probably was equivalent to holding a title of nobility. "I understand you're on the board," I said, "but your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property. I've checked the maps and my deed. This land belongs to me, and I have every right to restrict access." Karen's face flushed red. "Listen here," she said, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a threatening tone. "You clearly don't understand how things work around here. This road has been used by our community for years. You can't just move in and change everything because you feel like it." "Actually, I can," I countered. "That's exactly what property ownership means." She pulled out her phone, tapping furiously on the screen. "We'll see about that. I'm calling the HOA president right now." I shrugged. "Feel free, but it won't change anything. The HOA already told me this is outside their jurisdiction." That seemed to throw her for a loop. "What? When did they tell you that?" "A couple of weeks ago when I emailed about the trespassing issue." "Well, they were wrong," she snapped, putting the phone to her ear. "Henry, it's me. You need to come to the north entrance right now. The new homeowner has blocked the Pine Street access with a gate. Yes, a gate." I could hear the exasperation in the voice on the other end of the line, though not the exact words. Karen continued, "Well, someone needs to do something about this. It's unacceptable." She ended the call and glared at me. "Henry is coming. He'll straighten this out." "Great," I said. "In the meantime, you're still trespassing on my property." That was when Karen completely lost it. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know how much my house cost? Do you know who my husband is? We've lived in this community for 15 years. You can't just come in and dictate terms to us." She ranted. Another car pulled up behind hers. A guy in his 60s stepped out, looking tired already, like he'd been through similar situations with Karen before. "What's going on here?" he asked, approaching us. Karen immediately launched into her version of events. "Henry, this person has blocked the Pine Street access. He's claiming it's his property and calling us trespassers. You need to tell him the IETE. HOA won't stand for this." Henry looked at me apologetically. "I'm Henry Brooks, president of the Oak Ridge HOA. There seems to be some confusion." "There's no confusion," I interjected, extending my hand to shake his. "I'm the owner of this property, and this strip of land that people have been using as a shortcut is private property. I've put up a fence to prevent further trespassing and property damage." "Property damage? What property damage?" Karen scoffed. "Just last week, someone got stuck in the rain and tore up a section of my lawn," I explained to Henry. "But that's beside the point. I have maps from the county showing clearly that this is my land." I handed him a folded paper from my pocket. I'd started carrying the property map with me, anticipating confrontations. Henry studied the map while Karen fumed beside him. After a moment, he sighed. "Karen, it does appear this land is outside our subdivision boundaries." "That's impossible," she snapped, grabbing the map from him. "We've always used this road." "Using something doesn't make it yours," I pointed out. Karen thrust the map back at Henry and pulled out her phone again. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling the police." Henry's eyes widened. "Karen, I don't think that's necessary." "It absolutely is. He's blocking a public road. That's illegal." She was already dialing, turning away from us as if to prevent us from stopping her. Henry turned to me. "I apologize for this. Karen can be passionate about neighborhood issues." We both turned as we heard Karen speaking into her phone. "Yes, I need to report someone blocking a public road. Yes, it's an emergency. People can't get in or out. The address? It's at the north entrance to Oak Ridge Estates where it meets Pine Street." She was blatantly lying, making it sound like I'd blocked an actual public street rather than a dirt path on my private property. Henry looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Karen, you're misrepresenting the situation," he said, but she waved him off dismissively. "The police will be here soon," she announced triumphantly after ending the call. "Then we'll see who's in the right." "Yes, we will," I agreed, surprisingly calm. I knew I'd done my homework and was on solid legal ground. For the next 15 minutes, we waited in awkward silence. Karen paced back and forth, shooting daggers at me with her eyes. Henry tried to make small talk, clearly trying to de-escalate the situation. I answered his questions politely, but remained firm about my position. Finally, a police cruiser pulled up, lights off, but siren chirping briefly to announce its arrival. 2 officers stepped out, a younger woman and an older man. Karen immediately rushed over to them. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man has illegally blocked a public access road that our community has used for years." The female officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, please calm down. Let's sort this out step by step. I'm Officer Martinez. This is Officer Johnson." Officer Johnson approached me. "Sir, we received a call about a blocked road." "Officer, this isn't a public road," I explained. "It's my private property. People from the neighboring HOA have been using it as a shortcut without permission, and I've installed this fence to protect my property rights." "He's lying," Karen interjected. "That's always been an access road for our community." Officer Martinez turned to her. "Ma'am, please let us handle this investigation. Is there documentation about this being a public road or an easement?" "It's been used as a road for years. Everyone knows that," Karen insisted. "That's not how property law works," Officer Johnson said. "Sir, do you have proof this is your property?" I nodded, retrieving my folder from inside the house. "Here's my deed, the property survey from when I purchased the home, and county records showing the property lines. As you can see, this strip of land is clearly within my boundaries." The officers examined the documents carefully. Officer Martinez pulled up something on her cruiser's computer, presumably verifying the information. After a few minutes, she approached us. "The property records confirm what the homeowner is saying. This is private property, not a public road or a deeded easement," she announced. Karen's jaw dropped. "That's impossible. We've been using it for years." "Ma'am, using someone else's property without permission is trespassing, even if it's been going on for a while," Officer Johnson explained patiently. But what about prescriptive easements?" Karen sputtered, suddenly revealing she knew more about property law than she'd let on. "Those require specific legal conditions and generally need to be established in court," Officer Martinez replied. "They don't automatically apply just because people have been crossing the property." Karen was growing increasingly desperate. "This is outrageous. The entire community uses this access point. He can't just block it off." Actually, ma'am, he can, Officer Johnson said firmly. It's his property. Karen looked like she might explode. Her face had turned an alarming shade of red, and she was practically vibrating with rage. Do you have any idea who I am? My husband is a personal friend of the police chief. I'm calling him right now. The officers exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They'd clearly dealt with similar threats before. You're welcome to call whoever you'd like, Officer Martinez said evenly. But the property laws won't change based on who you know. As Karen furiously dialed her phone again, Officer Johnson turned to me. Sir, you're within your rights to install this fence on your property. If you continue to have issues with trespassing, don't hesitate to call us. This is a mistake, Karen shouted, phone pressed to her ear. You're going to regret this, both of you. She pointed at me and then the officers. Henry, who had been silently watching this unfold, finally stepped in. Karen, that's enough. The officers have made their determination. He turned to me. I apologize for the confusion and for Karen's reaction. The HOA will inform residents that this is no longer an access point. Karen looked betrayed. Henry, you can't be serious. We need to fight this. There's nothing to fight, Henry said tiredly. It's his property. As the officers prepared to leave, Karen made one last desperate attempt. She marched up to me, finger pointed at my face. This isn't over, she hissed. Not by a long shot. The HOA has lawyers, good ones. We'll see how smug you are when you're facing legal action. Karen, Henry called sharply. That's enough. Get in your car, please. With a final glare that could have melted steel, Karen stomped back to her SUV, slammed the door and peeled away, tires squealing. The officers nodded to me. Call if you need anything else, Officer Martinez said before they departed. Henry lingered a moment longer. Again, I apologize. I'll try to smooth this over with the board, but... He trailed off. But Karen won't let it go. I finished for him. He sighed heavily. Probably not. She's persistent. That was putting it mildly. As I watched Henry drive away, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen's threat lingered in the air. This isn't over, and she was right about that at least. The battle for my property was just beginning. The next few days brought an uneasy quiet. No more cars tried to access my property, but I frequently spotted unfamiliar vehicles driving slowly past my house, occupants staring at the new fence with obvious disapproval. I checked my security cameras regularly, half expecting to find someone trying to damage the fence, but thankfully, no one had gone that far. Then, exactly 1 week after the confrontation with Karen, I found an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, requesting my presence at their next board meeting to discuss the recent changes to the north access point. The letter was worded carefully, avoiding any claim of ownership over my property, but the implication was clear. They weren't done fighting. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. My first instinct was to ignore it. I had no obligation to attend an HOA meeting for a community I wasn't even part of. But then I reconsidered. Perhaps this was an opportunity to put the matter to rest once and for all. If I could calmly explain my position to the entire board, maybe they'd see reason and get Karen to back down. As Thursday approached, I prepared thoroughly. I made extra copies of all my documentation, rehearsed what I wanted to say, and even researched the HOA's own bylaws, which I found posted on their website. Interestingly, their own rules stated that the HOA had no authority beyond the community's boundaries, a fact I intended to point out if necessary. When Thursday evening arrived, I drove to the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse, an impressive building with manicured landscaping that screamed expensive HOA fees. I parked and took a deep breath before heading inside. The meeting room was already half full when I arrived. About 20 residents were seated in chairs facing a long table where 5 board members sat, including Henry and, of course, Karen. She didn't even try to hide her hostility, glaring at me openly as I took a seat in the back row. Henry called the meeting to order at precisely 7 p.m., working through some routine HOA business before addressing the matter of the North Access Point. He summarized the situation diplomatically, avoiding taking sides, then invited me to speak. As I walked to the front of the room, I could feel every eye on me. The tension was palpable, especially from Karen, who sat with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Thank you for inviting me," I began, placing my documents on the table. "I understand there's been some confusion about the strip of land that borders your community. I'd like to clarify a few points." For the next 5 minutes, I calmly explained the situation, how the land was indisputably my property, how I'd tried addressing the trespassing issue through proper channels first, and how I'd installed the fence only after experiencing property damage. "I have all the documentation here," I concluded, showing that this land is legally mine. While I understand it may have been used as a shortcut in the past, that use was never authorized by previous owners or by me. As I finished, Karen immediately jumped in before Henry could respond. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "That access point has been used by our community for over a decade. Just because you have some piece of paper saying you own it doesn't mean you can disrupt the lives of hundreds of residents." "Karen," Henry warned, "let's keep this civil." Another board member, an older gentleman, spoke up. "I'm curious, are we certain this isn't a prescriptive easement situation? If we've been using it for years without objection?" "I've researched that," I replied. "For a prescriptive easement to be established, the use needs to be continuous for a statutory period, which in this state is 20 years. Additionally, the use must be adverse to the owner's interests, open and notorious, and without permission. Since I objected to the use as soon as I became aware of it, that would interrupt any potential prescriptive period." The board members looked impressed, except for Karen, who rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're not a lawyer. You're just some guy who bought a house and decided to make everyone's life difficult." "Karen," Henry reprimanded, more firmly. "That's enough." A woman seated in the audience raised her hand. "I'd like to ask a question," she said when Henry acknowledged her. "What harm were we really causing by using that shortcut? It saved us time and didn't hurt anyone." "Except it did cause harm," I explained. "Just before I installed the fence, someone damaged my lawn while driving through during rainy weather, but beyond that, it's about property rights. Would any of you be comfortable with strangers regularly cutting through your backyards without permission?" That seemed to resonate with several residents, who murmured among themselves. Karen noticed the shift in mood and quickly tried to regain control. "The damage to your lawn was probably minimal," she dismissed. "And now you've caused major inconvenience to our entire community. People have to drive an extra 10 minutes to get around." "It's 3 minutes, Karen," someone in the audience corrected. "I timed it." Karen shot a venomous look in the direction of the voice. "The point is, he's being unreasonable and selfish." Another board member, a woman who hadn't spoken yet, leaned forward. "I have to ask, is this even within our jurisdiction as an HOA? The land isn't part of our community." "Exactly my point," I agreed. "In fact, your own bylaws, which I reviewed, state that the HOA's authority extends only to properties within the Oak Ridge Estate's boundaries." Henry nodded slowly. "That's correct, which raises the question of what we're even doing here." Karen slammed her hand on the table. "We're defending our community's interests. Just because something is technically legal doesn't mean it's right." "Karen," Henry said, his patience clearly wearing thin, "we can't force someone to provide access across their private property. The law's clear on this." "So we're just giving up?" Karen demanded. "What kind of leadership is that? We should Be consulting our attorneys." One of the other board members, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "I've actually already spoken with our HOA attorney informally about this situation. His opinion was that we have no legal grounds to force access across private property that isn't subject to an existing easement." Karen looked stunned. "You went behind my back to the attorney?" "I did my due diligence," he replied calmly. "Something you might consider before calling the police on our neighbors." A murmur ran through the room. Apparently, not everyone had heard about Karen's 911 call. Henry quickly tried to regain control of the meeting. "I think we've discussed this matter thoroughly. Unless there are any other questions?" An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "I'd just like to say, as someone who's lived here for 15 years, that while the shortcut was convenient, we managed fine before people started using it. It's only been in the last 8-10 years that people discovered that path. We'll adapt." Several others nodded in agreement, much to Karen's visible dismay. Henry looked relieved. "Thank you for that perspective. If there's nothing else, I believe we can consider this matter closed. The HOA will send out a notice to all residents informing them that the north access is permanently closed and is private property." "This is outrageous," Karen burst out. "We can't just surrender." "Karen, the meeting is concluded," Henry said firmly. "We're moving on to the next agenda item." I gathered my documents, nodded thanks to the board, and headed for the door. As I left, I could hear Karen still protesting, her voice rising as Henry tried to move the meeting forward. In the parking lot, I was approached by the elderly man who had spoken up. "Don't mind Karen," he said with a kind smile. "She means well, but she's used to getting her way. She'll find something new to fixate on eventually." I thanked him for his support, feeling cautiously optimistic as I drove home. The meeting had gone better than expected. Most of the board and many residents seemed reasonable once they understood the situation. But Karen's parting glare told me she wasn't done fighting yet. And I was right to be concerned. The next morning, I woke up to find my fence spray-painted with the words "Selfish Jerk" in bright red letters. My security camera had captured the vandalism, a hooded figure in the middle of the night, but their face wasn't visible. I couldn't prove it was Karen, though I had my suspicions. I reported the vandalism to the police, who took a report but warned me there wasn't much they could do without clear identification of the perpetrator. I spent my Saturday morning cleaning off the paint and reinforcing my security system with additional cameras. A week later, I received another letter, this one from a law firm representing the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. The letter claimed that residents had established a prescriptive easement through years of use and demanded that I remove the gate immediately or face legal action. I was furious, but not surprised. This had Karen written all over it. I contacted a property attorney of my own, who reviewed my documentation and the threatening letter. "This is a scare tactic," my attorney assured me. "Their claim of a prescriptive easement is weak at best. For one thing, the statutory period in this state is 20 years, and you mentioned the shortcut has only been used for around 8 to 10 years according to long-time residents. Additionally, you objected to the use as soon as you became aware of it, which interrupts any prescriptive period." She drafted a response letter citing relevant case law and statutory provisions, making it clear that I would vigorously defend my property rights if challenged in court. We sent the letter via certified mail to both the law firm and the HOA board. A few days after our response was delivered, I received an unexpected visit from Henry. He looked embarrassed as he stood on my doorstep. "I want to apologize," he said once I invited him in. "That letter from the attorney wasn't authorized by the full board. Karen went ahead on her own, claiming she had board approval." I wasn't surprised. "Let me guess, she's not backing down." Henry sighed heavily. "She's determined." but I want you to know that the board has officially decided not to pursue any legal action. We've issued Karen a formal warning about her conduct." "I appreciate that, Henry," I said. "But honestly, this is getting ridiculous. The vandalism, the legal threats. It's harassment at this point." "Vandalism?" Henry looked genuinely shocked. "What vandalism?" I showed him the security footage of my fence being spray painted. He looked troubled. "I had no idea. This has gone too far." He paused. "Look, I can't promise Karen will stop, but I want you to know the HOA doesn't condone this behavior." After Henry left, I felt slightly better knowing the full board wasn't against me. But Karen's vendetta was becoming a serious concern. I decided it was time to protect myself more thoroughly. That afternoon, I reached out to a local news station with a tip about HOA overreach and harassment. I explained my situation, mentioning how an HOA board member had called the police with false claims and was now potentially behind vandalism and unauthorized legal threats. The story piqued their interest. Property rights disputes with HOAs made for compelling local news. A reporter contacted me within hours, and we scheduled an interview for the following day. Karen must have caught wind of the upcoming news story because that evening, she showed up at my gate again. This time she wasn't honking or yelling. She looked calm, which was somehow more unnerving. "We need to talk," she said when I approached the gate. "This situation has gotten out of hand." "I agree," I replied cautiously. "Listen," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we can reach a compromise. What if the HOA pays you a monthly fee for access rights? We could draw up a formal agreement." I was surprised by this apparent change of heart, but something felt off. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in selling access rights. This is my private property, and I intend to keep it that way." Her forced smile disappeared instantly. "You're making a mistake. Do you really want to be known as the person who went against an entire community? How do you think that will affect your property value?" The threat was thinly veiled. "Are you threatening me, Karen?" "Of course not," she said sweetly. "Just pointing out the realities of real estate. Properties with difficult neighbors often struggle on the market." I'd had enough. "I think this conversation is over. Please leave my property." Her eyes narrowed. "The news story, that was you, wasn't it? You called the media." I didn't confirm or deny it. "Goodbye, Karen." As she drove away, I could see her angrily hitting her steering wheel. The next day, the reporter and camera crew arrived at my house. I showed them the fence, the security footage of the vandalism, and all my documentation proving my property rights. I was careful not to directly accuse Karen of the vandalism since I couldn't prove it, but I did mention the HOA board member who had called the police over the gate. The reporter also interviewed some of my neighbors who weren't part of the HOA, who confirmed they'd seen the steady stream of cars cutting through my property before the gate went up. One even mentioned witnessing confrontations between me and drivers who refused to acknowledge they were trespassing. The story aired that evening on the local news under the headline, "Property Rights Dispute, Homeowner Stands Up to HOA Pressure." It was a fair and balanced piece, presenting both sides of the issue, while emphasizing that legally, the land was indisputably my private property. The reporter had even reached out to the HOA for comment. Henry provided a diplomatic statement about respecting property boundaries, while making it clear that any harassment was not condoned by the board. Karen, interestingly, had declined to comment. The public response to the news story was overwhelming. The station's social media post about the segment garnered hundreds of comments, most supporting my right to protect my property. People shared their own HOA horror stories, and a few local attorneys even offered their services pro bono if I needed additional legal support. But the most surprising response came the day after the broadcast, when I received a call from the HOA's attorney, the same one who had sent the threatening letter. I'm calling to formally withdraw our previous correspondence, he said stiffly. Upon further review of the facts and circumstances, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA has decided not to pursue any claims regarding the property in question. I couldn't help but push a little. That's quite a change of heart. May I ask what prompted this review? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Let's just say the board has reconsidered its position in light of recent developments. Translation. The news story had completely changed the dynamics. With public opinion firmly on my side and their legal position weak, the HOA was backing down, or at least most of them were. Later that day, I received another unexpected visitor, one of the HOA board members I'd met at the meeting, the one who had consulted their attorney. I thought you should know, he said after I invited him in. Karen has been removed from the board. Removed? I was genuinely surprised. He nodded. After the unauthorized legal letter and the news story, well, it was the final straw. She's had a history of overstepping her authority, but this was too public, too embarrassing for the community. Never intended to cause problems for the HOA as a whole, I said honestly. We know that, he assured me, and most residents understand you were just protecting your property, but I wanted to personally apologize for how this escalated. As he was leaving, he hesitated. There's one more thing you should know. The board voted unanimously to issue a formal apology to you and to explicitly remind all residents that your property is private and not to be trespassed upon. You'll receive the letter tomorrow. True to his word, the official apology arrived the next day, along with a copy of the notice sent to all Oak Ridge Estates residents, which included a map clearly showing my property boundaries and a reminder that trespassing could result in legal consequences. I thought that would be the end of it. But a week later, I spotted a familiar white SUV parked at the end of my driveway. Karen was back, but this time she wasn't honking or making demands. She sat in her car for several minutes before finally getting out and approaching my front door. When I answered, she looked different, humbled, maybe even embarrassed. I owe you an apology, she said stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the words. My behavior was inappropriate. I was so stunned I didn't immediately respond. The thing is, she continued, that shortcut saved me 12 minutes on my commute. 12 minutes every day, both ways. That's 2 hours a week I now spend sitting in traffic. I understand it's inconvenient, I said, but that doesn't give you the right to use my property. She nodded reluctantly. I know. And I shouldn't have called the police or, well, everything else. I strongly suspected everything else included the spray paint, but I decided not to press the issue. I appreciate the apology, I said simply. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. I'm not on the board anymore, I heard. 15 years I've been on that board, she said, a hint of her old indignation returning. I've given countless hours to this community, fought for property values, maintained standards, and one mistake gets me thrown out. I could have pointed out that it wasn't just one mistake. It was harassment, potential vandalism, abuse of position, and more. But I saw no point in antagonizing her further. Communities can be complicated, I offered neutrally. She laughed without humor. That's one way to put it. She turned to leave, then hesitated. For what it's worth, I never meant for things to go this far. I'm used to getting problems solved. I nodded, recognizing that this was as close to a genuine apology as I was likely to get. Consider it water under the bridge. As she walked back to her SUV, her shoulders weren't quite as squared, her step not quite as imperious. The neighborhood, Queen had been dethroned, and while I took no pleasure in her fall, I couldn't help but feel that some justice had been served. In the months that followed, life returned to normal, or rather, to what it should have been all along. No more cars cutting across my property, no more confrontations with entitled neighbors. The fence stood strong, the gate remained locked, and my security cameras recorded nothing more exciting than occasional wildlife passing through. I did make one change, though. On the side of the fence facing the HOA neighborhood, I installed a small, tasteful sign. Private property, no trespassing. Thank you for your understanding and respect. It wasn't necessary from a legal standpoint, but it felt like a diplomatic gesture, acknowledging the change while firmly maintaining my boundaries. Interestingly, my relationship with the rest of the Oak Ridge Estates community actually improved after the dust settled. Henry and I became friendly, occasionally chatting when we ran into each other at the local hardware store. A few other neighbors would wave when they drove past my property on the main road. As for Karen, she eventually sold her house and moved away. I heard through the grapevine that she found another upscale community with an even stricter HOA, a perfect match for her controlling tendencies. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, always know your property rights. Doing my homework and having documentation ready made all the difference. Second, stand your ground when you know you're right, even when faced with intimidation. And third, sometimes going public with your story is the most effective way to shine a light on unreasonable behavior. But perhaps the most important lesson was about entitlement. Karen genuinely believed that her convenience was more important than my property rights, that her position on an HOA board somehow gave her authority over land that wasn't even part of her community. It was a stark reminder of how people can convince themselves they're entitled to things that don't belong to them simply because they've gotten used to having them. Now when I look out at my peaceful property with no uninvited cars tearing across it, no tracks in my lawn, and no entitled neighbors honking at my gate, I feel a deep appreciation for the quiet sovereignty of ownership. This land is mine, not a public convenience, not a community shortcut, but my own private space to enjoy as I see fit. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that some boundaries are worth defending, even when it means standing up to the most entitled Karen an HOA has ever produced.